Thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I call to order the meeting of the Mbta Finance Committee for March 10th, 2022. First, we have approval of the summary. I beg your pardon.
That's okay.
It's just a message that came up.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay to continue.
Okay.
We have approval of the summary minutes of the Finance Committee meeting of January 20th, 2022. Do we have a motion to approve? Do we have a motion to approve?
I just don't move to approve, even though I wasn't there.
And I'm not able to move,
Okay.
so I can't move either.
Okay. You want to second that?
Second.
Okay. Is there any discussion? Anyone would like to abstain? They were not okay. Mayor Wood will abstain, and Councilmember Snyder. Okay. Moved and seconded. All those in favor and aye. Opposed and abstain. That's two abstentions. Councilmember Snyder and Mayor Woods. It can pass with one vote. Is that correct?
I don't believe so, but Councilmember Snyder and Mayor Wood can vote even though they weren't there.
Okay.
If they choose to.
Was the minutes good to you?
I'm sorry. What?
Would the minutes look good to you? And I voted favor.
Me too.
Okay, that passes. Next, we move on to the Finance Committee meeting schedule. Mr. Long.
Thank you, Mayor Rochelle. This is simply an action to align the future Finance Committee meetings on the same meeting with the authority. We do have wording in the motion so that if there's adjustments to the authority schedule, we'll try to match those adjustments to the Finance Committee schedule.
Any comments? Questions for Mr. Long? Thank you. I would just mention that I hope we can going forward be as flexible as possible time-wise, because sometimes the finance packets get rather involved, so we would need to add just a bit of time for that. They become quite full. So do we have a motion?
So move.
Do we need to repeat the motion, or is it self-evident that
I think on this one is self-evident. You're okay.
Is it also, I guess we're looking for the attorney, no need to repeat the motion, correct?
I don't think,
Yes. Okay.
I don't think there's anything.
No, Madam Chair.
Okay. Moved by Mayor Wood. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. Moved in second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstained? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Moving on to number 4, FY23 Regional Revenue Fund Budget. Mr. Longy.
Thank you, Mayor Rochelle. This is the first of 3 budgets tonight. Ultimately, it seeks to move for authority approval, a recommendation for authority approval, excuse me, of $206 million in regional revenue funds. To go over the staff report very briefly, the regional revenue fund budget is where we fund projects from. I think the most efficient way for me to address this with you is if you could pull out attachment A from your packet. The budget has a lot of complexity in it for especially our new members. Although I believe Councilmember Snyder, you've heard this one a couple times. The authority does something that's rather unique to avoid going to the market to finance projects. We do what we refer to as forward appropriations. We took an extensive amount of time to talk to our auditors because a forward appropriation is effectively the authority deploying revenue that it has not yet received. The reason we can do this is because of the strength of our balance sheet, currently at about $1.3 billion. The reason our balance sheet is so strong is because the authority appropriates 100% of the project fund that's approved in the year of the initial appropriation. We don't break it out by fiscal years going forward. So that 1.3 that I was referring to, balance sheet strength, is money that has in its entirety been assigned to projects, but those projects have not spent the money yet. So when we were looking at, had requests from jurisdictions to allow their projects to move forward. Case in point would be, there's $50 million in projects that were approved as part of the 24-25 2-year update to the 6-year plan, that the project sponsor said, you know, authority, I can move forward with this and get this asset working for the region faster if I can spend the money faster. So we have a fairly complex process that is listed down in these line items on the budget spreadsheet. But I want to draw your attention to, in the notes column on the far right, there are some numbers, 4F in that column, which is roughly $15 million. What that $15 million represents is if every project that the authority has approved spends all of its money in fiscal 23, we will be cash flow short $15 million. However, what that $15 million does not include is that we have a $120 million working capital reserve. So even if that negative number were to go up to go over $120 million, we could still do lease financing or short-term financing before we would go to the bond market. Why do we do this? Because if we took the traditional debt issuance approach to forwarding projects above our cash flow, over a 20-year cycle of issuing bonds, it would cost the authority approximately $200 million. So this is really a strategy for the authority to use the strength of its balance sheet to fund these projects, while at the same time, I'll add, and you'll see in the next line, earn interest on that money through our, I'll say, pretty sophisticated investment program. Why do I go into this detail? Because the auditors say I have to go into this detail because you need to be aware of what's going on here. So that's what line 4F represents. The negative $15 million is, again, if every project spent every nickel that had been appropriated to it, we have that small issue that we can actually cover with our working capital reserve. Next line down, 4G, is $20 million. That is the earnings projected for fiscal 23 on the investment portfolio. That money was earned on funds in the regional revenue fund and stays in the regional revenue fund. To move through the rest of the budget, if we go down to line 5C, the $201 million in that line is the projects that the committee so chooses, the authority will be asked to appropriate for in fiscal 23. So these projects are the last of the projects that were approved in the 18 to 23 inaugural 6-year program, and the projects from fiscal 24-25 update to the 6-year program that are highlighted in green in attachment B. That have said we can get our projects going if we have money sooner, and that's roughly $50 million. It doesn't look that way to the uninitiated, but this is a very well-balanced budget with all the explanation I just gave. It's a very safe budget. And so with that, as part of this action of approving the budget, you're not only approving the regional revenue fund budget, but you are approving $201 million in appropriations, or recommending those to the authority for adoption. With that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Long. Comments or questions? Mayor Wood.
Madam Chair. First, question and then a comment. Question about, so it looks like based on the projected revenues that come in versus the expenses, it looked like we actually bringing in more revenue than what we're expenses. Look like 77 million is roughly left over, and then you're kind of moving that out. Is that by design to have a surplus at the end?
Yes, we actually estimate our revenue because the last thing I want to do as CFO is go to this committee and then go to the authority saying, you need to pick a project to cancel because we overstated our revenue. So we purposely underestimate revenue, a reasonable amount. And because of course, any revenue that comes into the regional revenue fund stays in the regional revenue fund and gets used in the next allocation project. It's very helpful when we're doing project allocations on basically a 2-year cycle.
And then the comment I was looking at, the future appropriation finance, which is cool because you got that right above. It was interesting enough, the investment portfolio earnings. And even if you spent all our projects get spent up, there's still like a $5 million in excess outside of like what you're raising from those two. But I know at the bottom, you talked about the 120 million working capital reserve too. So yeah, I'm very comfortable with this. Go ahead.
Are there any other comments on that? And I think special congratulations is in order to the portfolio team who does this fantastic investing. $20 million is very impressive.
Listen, I'm trying to figure out how talented enough is going to invest my reserves.
We have a motion to recommend to the full authority the adoption of the proposed FY 2023 regional revenue fund budget.
It's so moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstained, motion carries. Thank you. Moving on to FY 2023 local distribution fund budget. Mr. Long.
This is personally my favorite budget because it has a lot of commas in it. And it is entirely encapsulated in the table on the back of the staff report. So to walk through this very quickly, unlike most budgets, this one has no carry forward because we send all of the 30% money out over the course of the year. We estimate that the revenue for the 30% will be 119 million for fiscal 23. We estimate likewise that we will send 119 million out to the localities over fiscal 23. Therefore, there will be no ending budget balance. I will note a couple of things. There's wording in the staff report that notes that we will distribute on a 30% basis in accordance with the Code of Virginia, the monies we receive. So where we typically underestimate revenue, we don't have to come back and ask the authority for permission to send that additional amount out. It will just automatically go out. I also want to note that if this does not occur, we have a milestone that's coming up. If this milestone does not occur in fiscal 24, it will definitely occur in fiscal 25. And that milestone is 30% distributions will break $1 billion. If not in fiscal 24, definitely in fiscal 25. And I think if you look at something that shows the General Assembly's action and the benefit to the region, fiscal 24 or fiscal 25, $1 billion just in 30% distribution.
That's just for Northern Virginia.
Just for Northern Virginia. I think that concludes my staff report.
That's wonderful news. Any comments or questions? Okay.
And that's not on any of our projects that's in our transactions, none of that. That's just our 30% that gets passed down to the localities.
The jurisdictions, including towns, get to decide how they want to use that money as long as it's used for a transportation purpose.
More questions or comments?
No.
Mr. Wood?
I guess one question I have, is there anything going on in Richmond in this legislative session that could alter these projections, either for the 70% or the 30%?
No.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, but the big picture, no, what we are working on is to see if the repeal of the grocery tax impacts the $20 million transfer that we received from the Commonwealth.
But the grocery, the reduction of the application of sales tax to food for human consumption and personal hygiene products, excuse me, will not, because the authority's sales tax is not levied on food for human consumption. And the impact of the hygiene product exemption is so minimal, it's not going to impact our numbers.
So where does the $20 million that we're not getting show up in our overall budget?
The $20 million, if actually the easiest thing to do is if we look at the numbers in the 30% budget, we have the sales tax, we have the transfer from the interstate operations and enhancement program. That's roughly looked at as $13 million. Grantor's tax, Commonwealth, Northern Virginia, Transportation District transfer is $20 million. So that is actually a fixed amount in legislation. We have a bit of risk on the transfer for the interstate operations and enhancement program, because what goes into that fund, ultimately the authority gets, I think it's approximately 8.4% of. I have questions down to Richmond because we've not received a transfer yet for fiscal 22. And between us and YouTube, I have a sneaking suspicion that with all the federal money coming in, perhaps some of that is moving through that fund, and Richmond may be looking at make some sort of adjustments so that we don't have a bonanza. But we don't have enough transparency into the makeup of those numbers to be able to analyze it.
So, Madam Chair, if I might, just for this committee, is it possible after the legislative session ends and the veto session that these numbers could change? Both the 70% and the 30%.
I don't think they change negatively, because the money's going into the fund that this transfer comes out of are only getting larger, with the addition of like federal funds and stuff like that.
No, is that short term though? Is that just for 2 years or 1 year? I'm just trying to
It would
figure
be,
out what
it would be based on the fund balance. So yes, I mean, I would look at it as short term.
Okay.
We're not changing our longer term horizon on it until we have more clarity from VDOT. I mean, I've made some outreaches to VDOT CFO. The first time I did it, admittedly, I realized she was probably walking out of her office to a CTV meeting. And so I followed up at the beginning of this week and basically asked the question again. But this ultimately is a revenue source that we don't have good transparency because it's so very deep in VDOT's budget.
And this is what we used to refer to as the I-81 money. And it was an incremental growth. And then from fiscal year, what was it, 20 and beyond, we were supposed to receive $20 million in use. But I think that they scaled that back.
Yeah, even after the incremental growth period, we pointed out to them very early in preparation for, I believe, the 21 General Assembly session, that there's no way they were going to make those numbers, the 20 million. They then recalculated it and represented it as part of the omnibus transportation bill to be the 8% of the fund in VDOT. So we've not increased our revenue, our baseline revenue estimates looking forward to our calculating pay-go for the upcoming 2-year update for the 6-year program. We're holding it steady because I think it would be, certainly if that number were to drop, I suspect there would be a hue and cry from the authority because we were promised 20, got 3.5. We then promised 13, and we're waiting for it to arrive.
No.
Mayor Wood.
So this distribution budget is pretty much whatever it comes, it's just pass through. The seven- so
Everything that gets transferred from the state,
it's just
30% gets taken off and sent to the locality.
okay.
Those certification requirements are met, we transfer the money.
There is something that the city and county staff have to do to keep that money flowing. But we've got that, we work very well with them. And if there is a hiccup, we see it coming months in advance and get it fixed.
Yeah.
Supervisor Alcorn, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so the old I-81 money, so we're now looking, it was gonna be 20 and then we didn't get 20. And it's gonna be 13. So is there any indication about what that might be going forward? Or is that,
That's the question I've been asking Richmond myself.
we don't know?
We don't know. But I think it would be pretty untenable for them to, well, first of all, they'd have to get it in the budget because it is a budget action. And it's really not, the 8.4% really isn't a question. It's what else is flowing in that fund. And like I said, I think there may be some hesitancy because there, and this is my speculation, is that the inflows to that fund may be a lot larger than what they thought they were going to be when they committed to the 8%
Well, it certainly would be nice for them to make up the money that was diverted.
It would be nice for them to follow the budget and transfer the money that the budget says we're supposed to transfer. And if we get too far down the road, I know that the authority members, I can call on the authority membership and Tracy Baynard, but I don't want raise too many storm flags until we try it on the staff to staff.
Thank you.
Do we have a motion to recommend to the full authority the adoption of the proposed FY23 local distribution fund budget?
So moved, Madam Chair.
Second.
Thank you. Moved and seconded. All in favor? All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. Thank you. Okay, moving on to item number 6, FY23 operating budget. Mr. Longley.
This is the smaller of the three budgets. We have two new committee members. We have authority members in the audience. We discussed this staff report and the details of this budget in depth at our January meeting. The committee, through frankly, much of it came from Chairman McKay, raised some questions and asked for additional information. Unless the committee would desire otherwise, I suggest that I go with the changes that we made and not talk about the base budget, but talk about the enhancements that were the center of that equation. And of course, I don't want to short any questions or any dialogue, but I also want to be respectful of the clock.
That's fine, Mr. Longley, in the interest of time.
Thank you. What we did with the staff report is we underlined where we made changes in the January presentation, as noted in the background section. Really, in addition to the questions that Chairman McKay asked, he also asked if potentially we could phase some of these items in. And so the underlines that you see in the staff report are simply, after talking to Keith and Monica, we could phase in the planning position that we're requesting, bring that person in at mid-year, effectively cutting the ongoing costs in half, but still the one-time cost for laptop, et cetera, would still be there. We did that thinking, given all of the rest of the personnel changes that we are going through, it might be a little difficult to onboard that person without those changes. Plus the planning team is so busy with the 6-year program update and the transaction. The other item that we split into 2 phases is we put in a request for $250,000 to upgrade our websites. Our websites have been basically homegrown. The PIMS is an exception that was professionally developed. The transaction website was professionally developed. But so now we also have the issue where we've got websites. Then we have our corporate one. Our corporate one was basically, like I said, homegrown and is starting to show some aches and pains of that. And we need to have that re-examined. It is much more expensive to take existing websites and bring them up to standards than it is to just start new. And because of the information contained on these that the public does often compliment us on and rely on, we have to keep that archived information available. So what we proposed is called a split procurement. We would do a competitive RFP in fiscal 23, and we would split the work in half. Split procurements are typically frowned upon. It's usually not a positive term unless you're very transparent with your governing body that what you plan to do. And the vendor knows that the second phase of it, the fiscal 24 activity, is contingent upon fiscal 24 budget action. So that kind of recaps the that aspect of the operating budget. With that, what I'd like to do is address the need for the 3 positions. So I'm going to kind of go into underlying areas. So on page 3 of the staff report, the accounting technician, and I'll be brief. As we hired financial staff, we typically had to hire them at a fairly high level because you can have an accountant do bookkeeping, but you can't have a bookkeeper do accounting. And we needed an accountant as an example. We needed a portfolio manager. We needed a financial analyst. The request for this position is driven by volume. So we are asking for an accounting technician position, which is more on the clerical side, still complex work, but we need somebody to help us handle the volume of transactions. We have metrics in here. Every 2 years, we seem to be doing $500 million in projects. The number of reimbursements we expect to go up, I think, 75%. I'm sorry, the dollar value of the number is going up 75%. The dollar value is going up 72%. This position is fairly critical for us to be able to get the reimbursements out, given we are increasing the number of projects without reducing them. We are closing them out much slower than we're adding them on. I also want to note that review of expense reimbursements is not just a finance activity. Every expense reimbursement entails involvement from the planning staff as well. We look at those together. So that same volume that I just talked about is also part of the need for the planning position that we're proposing bringing on board at mid-year. With that, I would like to turn it over to Keith Jasper, who will address the need for the mapping position. I will do a bit of an introduction on that, saying that, I'm sorry, I said mapping position, modeling position. Sorry, Keith. The authority's 6-year, a 5-year strategic plan has always called for a modeling function. We are bringing this forward relatively late in the 5-year plan cycle because of a variety of factors. Number one, we were growing up. Number two, we wanted to make sure that the mapping solution was technically compliant with everybody we need to talk to. I said mapping again, didn't I? We wanted to make sure the modeling solution was technically compliant with everybody that we need to share data with and work with. That includes COG, who for some period of time had not decided on what mapping solution it was going to use. Modeling, again. I can now see it in your eyes when I do it. It's really, I'm getting embarrassed. So we brought in jurisdiction members that have modeling, modeling functions in-house to make sure that our proposed solution would be compliant with what they're doing. We brought in experts from Mbta, we brought in experts from Fairfax County. We brought in, we consulted with COG. So what we have actually done and what prior budget actions, green lighted was we have the servers. We have the modeling software. We also have mapping software, but that's a different issue. We have the modeling software installed. We have the data storage, because this takes a lot of data storage. We have those in place. What we need now is the jockey to run. Okay, that's really what this position is about. We have all the other investments. We waited strategically. We also had not requested positions last year because nobody knew what COVID was going to do to anybody. Financially, wasn't the worst thing in the world. Terrible thing in many other categories. So with that, I'll turn it over to Keith Jasper.
Thanks, Mike. Chair Rochelle, members of the committee. I'd like to preface my remarks by saying or observing that the growth in staffing at Mbta is driven by different factors to those that are driving growth in your jurisdictions. As you all know, Mbta was created in 2002, but did not start hiring people until 2013 or fiscal year 2014, after HB 2313 came into effect. And so the way I see it, and Mike and Monica see it, is that Mbta's growth is more analogous to a startup company within the public sector. We started from zero. We're now at $2.5 billion. And that's after 8 years. So obviously, I can't speak in detail about the factors that affect growth in your localities, but I suspect it's got more to do with relatively stable population growth. So it's kind of don't compare us to yourselves in that regard, because the factors are different. Further, the growth that we're trying to address for these 2 new posts, which are very dear to me, because if the committee endorses and the authority approves these positions, that is working for me. And I would be greatly appreciative of that, because the growth that's driving the need for these positions is already baked in over the past 8 years. The workload responsibilities are going to grow regardless, and these 2 new positions will help us to keep pace with that growth. But in addition, we need to take into account not just of the investments already made, but future cycles of transaction and 6-year program updates, leveraging or mitigating the disruption of transportation technologies, integration of Mbta's core values, equity, sustainability, and safety, into transaction, the 6-year program, and across other areas of what Mbta does. Maturation of our capabilities, alongside, as Michael has already mentioned, the expansion of Mbta's project portfolio, in-housing of key responsibilities, such as simulation modeling, leveraging of big data analytics to streamline our processes and provide high-quality public-facing information to Northern Virginians, and you've all had a taste of that through our dashboard. And finally, proactive approaches to support the decarbonization of the transportation system. And I say finally, that doesn't include the pandemic, which has kind of thrown the whole approach to long-range transportation up in the air, because we know there's going to be a new normal. We do not yet know what it is, but that does affect the way we go about our planning. So with that, I won't go in detail on what's actually in the document unless you have questions, but there's some introductory text. Mike's covered this fairly well on the bottom of page 3 and the top of page 4, and how in particular these 2 new staff, you need to take them together, because those 2 plus the 5 positions that we already have represents the rounding out of a team. And so what's going to be accomplished is going to be accomplished with both of these 2 new positions, but they're described in more detail on pages 4, 5, and 6. I'd like to jump to attachment B, which addresses 2 of the 3 questions that Chairman Kay raised at the January 20th meeting. The first question was about potential cost savings. If I can't convince you these positions are needed because of workload, let me try and persuade you that there are some significant potential cost savings and costs avoided associated with these positions. So that was kind of question one from Chairman Kay. So on the first page of attachment B, you see two items, two activities. The first one includes terms like congestion reduction relative to cost, HB 599, long-term benefit. These are all requirements in Virginia Code that MBTA must address through transaction and a 6-year program. I also add that they're actually unfunded mandates, but we have to address them. And the way we've addressed them to now is to outsource the work to consultants. With these positions, we will be able to begin the transition of some of that outsourcing in-house. Not necessarily a full-blown update of transaction. That may just be too much of a surge for us to take on board right now. But certainly these three things I've just mentioned, and we have some evidence from previous cycles that we would typically save in excess of $150,000 every 2 years through these positions just by bringing in-house those particular functions, which, as I say, are required by Virginia Code. The second thing on this first page here is reevaluation of approved projects in the event of significant scope changes. This thankfully hasn't happened very much so far. We anticipate with an increasing portfolio of projects, this will happen more often. The one situation so far where we've had to go back and do this was thankfully a relatively small thing. We still had to outsource it to our consultant at the time, and you can see the cost that was involved here. That was a very simple thing to model, probably about the most simplest end of the range we could think of. More likely we would see in the future changes that affect different intersection or interchange configurations, new terminals for widening projects, or changes in transit capacity projects. When these things happen, given that Virginia Code says that we must give priority to projects that achieve the greatest congestion reduction relative to capacity, if the project scopes have changed, it isn't just a question of the project that had the scope change. Because they're all evaluated as part of the candidate pool, we pretty much have to go back and consider how the change in one project scope affects how it's ranked against all the other projects in that candidate pool. So that's something that we have to bear in mind. It hasn't happened much so far. It's likely to happen more often and more significantly in the future. Turning quickly to pages 2 and 3.
And if I could, for 1 minute, and I don't want to still keep thunder. It will happen more often because we're doing out-year programs. By the time the project sponsor is ready to advance and execute an SPA and get their SPA approved, because we're doing out-year, like the 6-year program that we're working on now for fiscal years 26 and 27, by the time they're ready to advance, I've already had conversations on our current funding program. Hey, there are some changes, and what do I need to do to really retain the fund? Sorry.
I'll also add, while Keith is interrupted, inflation, which we have not had to grapple with in decades, roughly 40 years, to the extent we had to grapple with it in the last quarter of last calendar year, is going to require scope changes. It's almost inevitable. If inflation from the last quarter of last year had been applied to the 6-year program, the $201 million that you approved to recommend to the authority would be worth 36% less. The only way a project sponsor alternative is to add more money or redefine the project. So with that.
So on page 2 of attachment B are a couple of activities which are not currently undertaken for various reasons. The first one being independent verification of the consultant's work, essentially this is specifically for transaction, which is a once in every 5-year effort. We don't have the capability at present in-house to double check the work the consultant does. These additional positions will enable us to be able to do this. It's something that is a good best practice to have. We trust our consultant, but it's also good to verify what they're doing. We conservatively estimate that this would avoid costs potentially in the range of 150 to 250,000 every 5 years, and that's just on transaction. If we were to do that on other things, obviously that cost saving would be greater. Further down on page 2, attachment B, you see a reference to LTB or long-term benefit. These is another requirement from HB 2313. We currently outsource to the consultant to do this once every 2 years, which means we basically do it as we evaluate the projects for each cycle of the 6-year program. What we're proposing to do here is to do it every year. So every 2 years, we do it one more time. And the reason why we would do that is because we don't recalculate long-term benefit after the authority adopts a program until some way down the road when it's time for new applications. We think that we're doing it sooner. That will help everybody, ourselves and the 9-member jurisdiction staff in particular, to understand what the status of long-term benefit is before diving in to a new round of project funding applications. And we know that activity will cost about 150,000 every 2 years if we outsource it. Ad hoc modeling at the bottom of page 3 is another important area. You may recall that in summer of 2020, not long after the pandemic started, the authority did approve us to go ahead and fund some additional work with our consultant to do some kind of scenario analysis about some of the trends we were seeing early on during the pandemic, to understand if those trends continue, what that might mean for the way we go about our long-range planning. It was a tremendously valuable exercise. It cost us about $45,000. I've got no qualms about the value for money of the work, but we could do that in-house if we had the tools and the staff. And finally, in the table on page 4, modeling services to member jurisdictions possible. We're making no play here to kind of try to become clearinghouse for modeling in the region, but we do also know that many of the smaller jurisdictions do not have in-house modeling capabilities. As Mike said earlier, we've developed a modeling approach which is consistent with all the jurisdictions who do have a modeling approach in the region, as well as the Transportation Planning Board as well. So we can fill a void there, and we are already aware of interest within the region to use MBTA's new model, even though we've not made it available to anyone at this point in time. So that was question 1 from Chair McVeigh, and question 2 was about MBTA's unique responsibilities compared to similar bodies in the region. In this case, the similar bodies really would be the Transportation Planning Board and the Commonwealth itself with respect to their long-range plans and programming activities. And really there are, on the surface, some very good similarities with what we do, but because of those Virginia Code requirements I mentioned earlier, there are unique requirements placed on MBTA, which are not even placed on any other region in the Commonwealth. So obviously what the state does with VTrans and what a Transportation Planning Board does with its plan Visualize 2045 are similar, but they're not really usable from our point of view. We've worked hard with TPB to have a similar model base, but the way we do things is different. And indeed, just to drive the point home, when HB 599 was enacted in 2012, at that time MBTA did not have staff, and so VDOT did the work, and VDOT, knowing the capabilities of the region's models at that time, actually commissioned a consultant to build a completely new model for them at that time to meet the requirements of HB 599. And so that's not changed. we need a far more sophisticated version of the model that's as in order to meet the requirements of the junior code places upon us. I think I've gone on too long, so I should probably.
The last bit of information that Chairman McKay had asked for was some metrics on the growth of the authority. So that is attachment C. It's pretty self-explanatory. I will go to the color bars because what that points to is workload. It shows that for fiscal years, 2 fiscal years, we will be doing the transaction preparation for the transaction update and doing the 6-year program update at the same time, which puts a lot of stress on everybody, but especially the planners. I'll also note, as terms of size, in 14, our audited balance sheet was 290 million. We're projecting in fiscal 23 that we will be greater than 1.5 billion. We show the interest earnings, 82,000. We hit a high point of 28 million. That's a combination of using the tools that the finance committee endorsed and the authority approved to have a sophisticated investment portfolio. It dropped down, obviously with COVID, but we're projecting it to be 20 million. You look at some of those numbers, 1 year of interest earnings, which is not taking any money out of the tax transfers from the Commonwealth. 1 year of interest earnings can pay for multiple years of the operating budget. I think the rest of the numbers, if you look, the lower box, the top line shows our FTE counts. We started at 6, went up to 8 and 17. We've added a couple positions. We had a mid-year adjustment that we very much appreciate for this fiscal year. But we are still trying to catch up for not asking. And again, the growth of the program. So, we are asking to go to 17. We know that's a big ask. With that, I think if Monica, do you have any wrap up or?
I think both Keith and Mike have stated the comments that I would have made. And again, in many ways, the authority is still a startup, if you will, compared to some of the other entities that we see and we work with daily. But again, one of the key points regarding the biannual updates of the 6-year program, I've talked to several of locality staff members about project changes or project scope changes. And right now I tell them, well, you'll have to pay, and not only for the run of your project, you'll have to pay for every project that was in that cycle. When we accommodated previously, it was under a contract that we had with the consultant. That contract has expired. And again, because we're doing out-year programming, we will get to a point that we will be asked more frequently. Additionally, I know that, especially when we were newer in HB 2313, the discussion was to keep authorities small, keep the staff small. I would say we are still small, but yet we are efficient. We try to make sure that we are stewards of great stewards of the taxpayer dollars, and of course, delivering these projects. As Mike noted, every 5 years, we will be in the cycle of updating the 6-year program and transaction at the same time. Sounds like a great idea. It is stressful. But having said that, we're open for questions.
I would like to share something and make a comment. I was the one who requested the economic impact of the regional funding in Northern Virginia. And I want to share why I requested that. And it's very important, whether we're talking about the addition of staff or the tools that staff uses. I think it's helpful to remember that staff and tools actually run the processes and the procedures that really brought about this tremendous positive economic impact on Northern Virginia. So with that, are there any comments or questions? Yes, Supervisor Alcorn.
Chair, I actually have a question about IT services. And by the way, thank you very much for answering those questions in great detail. You mentioned for the modeler that we already have the services, we have the software.
Yes,
Is that outsourced or is it?
we outsource all of our IT infrastructure. So we've acquired services under a contract that automatically gets renewed, not automatic, that keeps the servers fresh. We don't have any boxes in offices. We don't
That's what I
have
wanted to
any-
make sure, because that is not very startup. You know, so the authority does not own any boxes of servers.
Not in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
We don't have any lights blinking in the closet anymore.
Okay, so that is, okay, I just wanted to make sure that's how it's working. And you acquired rights to the Mountain software, right?
So
That's,
it's a license.
it's a license, right? Okay, all right, just want to make sure. Thank you.
Mayor Wood?
Yeah, I was just looking at, just how thoroughly, just going back to looking at where you all, and looking at the attachment C, right? House Bill 20, when you started in 2014, you had a staffing of 6 people here. And you started out with, it looks like, projects. You started off with 33 projects and with a staff of 3, and you didn't increase again until 2017. And from there, you went to a staff of 8, right? But your projects increased tremendously. We had 82 projects. Now we're at the point in 2023, you're proposing a staff of 17, but you have close to 158 projects. Your workload is continuing to increase with the same amount of staff. You started off the conversation saying this is the smallest of the 3 budgets. And with that said, even looking at the interest that you're making off the investments can pay for this. To me, this is like a no-brainer. I don't see any reason, me personally, for a split procurement. I don't think that, I think that if we have the money now, we should pay for it now rather than delay it and just have these positions fully funded. So that's just my comments on that.
So my question is, if I had a citizen say to me, all right, what does this mean to me? What does this mean to me? I understand from a management standpoint and the idea that we need some help in the auditing and tracking money. Believe me, for me, that's not a problem, because the worst thing that could happen would be we'd lose control of the finances or something serious would happen there. So, but with regard to the modelers and the planners, what do I say to somebody who says, what am I getting as a result of this?
Councilmember Snyder, we could point to individual projects that are in, and PIMS does that. You know, when you had a public comment period, you got lots of positive feedback on PIMS. So we have the projects that we can point to via PIMS impacting all areas of the region. In addition to that, we've got the positive economic benefits. And one of the proposals is obviously we will update this after the next 2-year update. So, whether it's somebody in Falls Church where we've done a number of projects, especially given the scale, or whether it is supporting VRE, supporting Mbta, Route 1 BRT. There is a positive commuter impact on there that you can look at on a project basis, but you can also look at it in one of the statistics here is the number of hours saved.
Right, my question isn't going that way. My question is, what additional benefit am I getting as a result of these new positions? In other words, what are they doing that's new that you weren't doing before?
Well, we are continuing a progression of complying with statutes. We're phasing in, as Keith noted, we're still in startup mode. We're phasing in compliance with that statute. As we deploy more money, the projects are getting more sophisticated. They are getting grander. The authority is the largest contributor to the Route 1 BRT, which is probably going to be a backbone of BRT initiatives through the region. We need the resources to make sure that we comply with the law and that we do it in a qualitative sense as well, as just checking a box. One of the items we didn't bring up is the authority has a long-term financial interest in every one of these projects. We are not monitoring that. Some headlines come up if somebody goes to sell something that we, is partially funded. And we'll talk to that jurisdiction. None of those have come to fruition. But we also have to monitor those. If we don't do that, then potentially the General Assembly can say, okay, you didn't follow what we asked you to do. We'll rearrange your 30%.
And I think, if I can ask you a question related to it, is workload, right? We've more than quadrupled the number of projects that we're doing. The same amount of staff, so to add another planner, we have somebody else being able to trickle down and get that workload. Like I run a barbecue business. I can't cook 1,000 ribs, so I gotta bring on another pit master, right? So you gotta bring on another planner to help handle that load. So you tell them, we're taking on more capacity, more projects, right? So this is how you explain it to your taxpayers. So now we gotta add another staff member to handle that load because they can't continue to handle the same load. They can't carry it. It's just not enough for one person to take on, to go from 33 projects to 158 projects. It just doesn't, to me, it don't make sense. It's a no-brainer to me.
Okay, so that's one area. Another area, you mentioned some savings as a result of the ability to do in-house what you're now outsourcing. So I would ask that we do some tracking of that just to make sure that we're getting what is projected and we can modify things accordingly. And then the other element here that I think is new is the a greater focus on federal funding and federal projects to bring in the maximum benefit from federal developments into this region. So I understand that these positions will help us do that more than we have done in the past. Is that right? Okay. I'm just, I want the rationales laid out here, not just in management terms, but in what does it mean to the public? And I think I've heard enough on that.
And Councilmember Snyder, a lot more of what's on the screen right now. Economic stimulus for all of us, all across Northern Virginia.
Thank you.
So with that, do we have a motion to recommend to the full authority adoption of the proposed FY 2023 operating budget?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor? Opposed, abstaining, motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Longy, would you object to foregoing the next three?
Not at all, Mayor Rochelle. I will note that all of those reports on the investment portfolio, revenue, and operating budget are very positive.
Do you have any?
I could tell you the full authority meeting.
Okay. Many thanks to staff for providing all of the extra information that you provided. Is there any other business to come before the committee? Okay, then we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone, very much.